about the horrendous attack of Hamas in Israel. And I have to admit, I just sat there shell-shocked. I could not believe what I was hearing, that such brutality, such evil actions could be perpetrated in the 21st century. But there you have it. And for a long time, I had a pall over me. It seemed to be the wrong thing to do, to be on a holiday when all of this was going on in Israel. I eventually came to the realisation, wouldn't matter where I was, it still would have happened, and there's nothing I can do about it except to pray, and that's what I have been doing since then, and I hope you have too. But what I'd like to do today, something that is largely missing from the churches, is talk about Israel. When I first got saved, Israel would get mentioned quite regularly. And then somewhere over the last 40 years, gradually Israel has disappeared from the church's agendas, and you very rarely hear any preaching or discussion or even calls for prayer for Israel, except from a very small group of churches that hold very closely to the Messianic Jewish teachings. But for the vast majority of churches, Israel seems to have become irrelevant. There are strange doctrines around that God has abandoned Israel and that the church is now the spiritual Israel. I'm sorry, there's nothing in the Bible to support that. It's rubbish. God has never abandoned Israel, and I'll show you why this morning. And whilst we are not spiritual Israel, we are grafted into the vine of Israel. I don't know whether you see yourself as spiritual Israel. I see myself as a follower of Christ, not a follower of Israel. And to see myself any other way is to deny what's in the Bible. But we are joint heirs with them. They still have an opening. And the Bible speaks in the last days that there's going to be a massive turnaround in Israel where they will turn to the Lord in great numbers. And at the moment, the last figures I could find, there's about 4.5% Christians in Jerusalem. So they haven't got there yet, not by a long shot. Now, you can't rely on figures because they're always just a sample population and they extrapolate across the lot. There could be 50% Christians, but I'm happy to work on 4.5. It's the only figure I could consistently find. There's a long way to go. But I want to talk to you this morning on the Enigma, which is Israel. And for the first time ever, I have notes that I'll be working from that I have copies of if anybody would like a copy of them. At the moment, the way things are going, the stories that are being spread and the spin that is being put onto this whole scenario, coming out of ignorance of who Israel are and why it is an absolute miracle that Israel exists. The word enigma means something that's inexplicable or not understandable, almost bordering on irrational. Israel should not exist. Not only should it not exist, it should certainly not be in the piece of land that it once occupied. Not only should it not exist and not be on the piece of land that it once occupied, it should have long since lost its language and customs. All four of those things are clearly portrayed in front of us right now. Israel, after literally thousands of years, has held their customs, has held their language, and now holds their land because God has said they are his special people. And God promised he would bring them back. There's been a lot of nonsense over ownership of land lately. I don't know what your thoughts were on the word that was roundly defeated a couple of weeks back. I'll be up front and say I am so glad that it was. But that's not to say people who said yes were wrong from my perspective. But the whole thing is based on a fallacy, and the fallacy is that the Aboriginal people actually own Australia and that we have invaded and we're here under false pretences. I am sorry, no Aboriginal person owns any more of Australia than any of us own any of Australia. God owns Australia. God owns the world. God created it. We are all tenants in common. The Aboriginals are tenants. The white Anglo-Saxons are tenants. The Indians are tenants. All the people that are in this country and in every other country on the world are all tenants of God on his land, and that's not contested. All right? Israel are a very special people. Let me run you through a brief synopsis. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1 to 3, we find the call of Abram, not yet called Abraham, originally called Abram. Exalted father, and he becomes father of many, or is it the other way around? I can't remember. One is exalted father and the other is father of many, but initially his name is Abram. The Lord has said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people and your father's household and go into the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you a name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." That is a covenant. That is a promise. That is a contract that God made with Abraham. How many people heard a condition on that? There's none. God has said, "I will." If God says, "I will," he does. All right? It's not conditional. It's not a contract. It's not an idea or a concept. It's a contract. It's God saying this will happen. So we have Abraham called out of, what was he? He was a Armenian, wasn't he? He came out of Ur. I'm not sure what race he originally was, all right? Doesn't matter. God chose him for God's own purposes to be the progenitor of a new people. And Abram came out as God called him out, and he began to move forward into the land that God gave him, the land of Canaan, the land that is now known as Palestine. Abraham had a son named Isaac. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 to 7. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Because remember, God had promised Abram he would become a great nation. It's very hard to have or become a great nation if you have no offspring. It doesn't matter how good you are in every other area, you can't become a great nation without children. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Here is a second promise of God to Abraham. From you is not just going to come a son or a daughter, it's going to be a huge number of people. And of course, Israel did grow to be millions. I don't know if ever you tried to count the stars. I usually give up at about 150. Now, did I count that one or not? Oh, 1, 2, 3. So I'll take God's word for it. Number of visible stars, don't know. The astronomers will tell you, but it's irrelevant, the figure. It's just huge number. And then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. And he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans." There, he came out of Ur, he was a Chaldean. "And give you this land to take possession of it." There is the second time that God has made this covenantal promise to Abram. You shall have this land. Not where you're standing, where I'm taking you, what I'm showing you. And not only will you have it, but you will have a family that will come from you who will become my people in that land of promise. Chapter 21 of the same book. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham. His name has changed by now because God changed it. In his old age, at the very time that God had promised him. And Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son that Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Don't give up waiting on God's promises. If he's promised you something, I don't care how ridiculous it may seem. Now, ladies, relax. I don't know that God has promised any of you in your senior years that you're going to have more children. You're probably hoping like mad he never does. But there are many things that God has promised us, and sometimes we're weary waiting for them. We pray for things and we don't see them happen overnight, and we think, oh God, you've let me down. You've failed. No, not necessarily. Sometimes you have to wait, and maybe even unto old age. You have to wait. Abraham had to wait, but he has his son Isaac. And he has the promised land covenant. All right? Now, Sarah, who was the wife of Abraham, didn't trust God to come across with a child. So she thought she would do things her own way. And in her scheming, she gave her slave Hagar to Abraham to become a concubine, to bring forth a son who Sarah would then claim as hers, which is a strange way of doing it. But, so that happened, and through Sarah's scheming with Hagar, Ishmael was born. Now you'll find that story in Genesis chapter 16, and it's worth reading it through, because have you ever asked yourself why Israel seems to be one of the most, if not the most hated nations on earth? Here's the genesis of part of it. In Genesis 16, now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children." Is that true? No, it's not true. He just hasn't yet given her the children. He hasn't stopped it. He just hasn't yet brought it forward. That's a case of saying, God, this is all your fault. How many times have you shaken your fist at heaven and said, God, this is all your fault? And it's often not God's fault. It's more often your own fault or the fault of someone else. Never God. God is never at fault. If he was, he couldn't be perfect. And he is perfect, so he's never at fault. Go and sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. And Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. And he slept with Hagar, and she conceived. And if you follow the story through, she brought the son, and his name was Ishmael. Now Sarah then gets pregnant, and all of a sudden she's looking at Hagar and Ishmael, and she's seeing them as rivals. So she speaks to Abraham and says, I don't want them here, send them away. And he does. He's an obedient little fella, isn't he? He's learnt the secret of a happy marriage. When she says do it, you do it. When she says stop it, you stop. And that's the way you have a happy marriage. There's a good lesson in there. So Hagar and Ishmael go off into the desert. They're about to die. God meets with them there. And he makes a promise to Hagar that her son won't die, that he too will become a nation, and he does. He subsequently is the progenitor of the Arab peoples of today. No love lost between Hagar and Sarah. Presumably, no love lost between Hagar and Abraham. No love lost between Ishmael and Abraham and Isaac. There's a feud there that started in that family. We're now something like 3,000 or 4,000 years down the track, and it is still there. The Arabs still detest and loathe the Jews. Isaac became the father of Jacob. Genesis chapter 25 again. And verses 19 to 26. If I get the right chapter, it'll make sense. 19 to 26. This is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, the sister of Laban and the Aramean. And Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. She didn't have to wait for 20 or 30 years like Sarah did. And the babies, because she's got twins, jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she inquired of the Lord. Now this is important. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau, which means red. And after this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, which means he grasps, or he figuratively, he deceives, actually. And so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Two sons. Both, God says, are going to be nations, but the younger, which is Jacob, will be the dominant. Sometime later, and I imagine as they grew up, because his mum liked Jacob more than she did Esau, she probably reminded Esau every now and again, "Your son is better than you, you know, he's just got a bit of an edge over you." I can just imagine there would have been a little bit of tension. And Jacob for himself is probably constantly reminding Esau, "Yeah, God favours me. I'm a little better than you are." You know what it's like when you've got something special, you know. You like people to know. And if you've got something special, being that God has said you're going to be his boss, then that's pretty special. There's tension. There's tension. Esau likes hunting. Jacob likes hanging around the tents. In fact, it sounds like he's a bit of a chef. He did some cooking at some point. He was a homeboy, and Esau was a countryman. And Esau's dad thought he was very special because he was out hunting and doing all these manly things while Jacob is sitting at home playing chess or something in the corner. Esau came in from hunting one day. He's famished, he's hungry, obviously didn't catch anything. And Jacob has been making some stew, some lentil stew. And Esau is so hungry, he actually manages to swallow his pride and asks his brother, "Can I have some of your stew?" Jacob, the deceiver, the supplanter, the grasper, Jacob says, yes, you can, but Give me your birthright in exchange for this stew. Now, Esau shows himself to be a really intelligent, fast-thinking man. What's my birthright worth to me? I'm dying. Okay, you can have it. So Jacob cheated his brother out of his birthright. For those of you who don't know, the birthright of a firstborn son was to inherit double what all the subsequent children would inherit. So Jacob at this point has now put a claim on twice as much of his father's possessions as Esau, which rightly should have been Esau's. That's the first thing that Jacob does to his brother. His brother goes on to become the father of the Edomites. Edom was a big country to the south of Israel, eventually. There's a big people there right now who detest Israel. It's no longer the Edomites. They faded from the world stage a long time ago. They were conquered multiple times and ultimately they disappeared. But at the time that Israel was at its height, Edom was also at its height, and there was constant tension between the two nations. So what was prophesied was exactly true, and there was no love lost. Once again, a feud that started in childhood carried on, but Jacob didn't just leave it with knocking off his brother's birthright. He also took his paternal blessing. In Genesis chapter 27, you will find that his mum, I'll just read a couple of verses. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak he could no longer see, he called for Esau his son and said to him, "My son, here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I'm now an old man and I don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your weapons, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food that I like and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau, and when Esau left for the open country to hunt game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son, "Look, take these off and I can read better. Said to her son, "Look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, bring us some game, etc., etc., etc. Now I tell you, go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats so I can prepare some tasty food for your father just the way he likes it." And if you keep on reading through that story, you'll find she dresses Jacob up in Esau's clothing so that he has the scent of his brother on him. She puts some of the goat skin around his hands and under his face, so just in case his dad touches him, he'll feel hairy. A whole deception. This is a very conniving, scheming woman. Now, I don't know if she was related to Sarah, but the two had a couple of things in common. I don't know if all these Jewish mums are like this with their sons, but there you go. There's a couple of classic examples in Genesis. The long and the short of it is the deception works. While poor old Esau was out still hunting, Jacob's mum prepares a meal, gives it to Jacob, he takes it in, gives it to his father, convinces his father that he is Esau, and his father confers a blessing on him. Now, I don't know about you, a paternal blessing to me is something that's nice. I mean, I'd like to think when my father died, he didn't despise me, that he liked me. And I'd like to think that when I die, my son won't think that I despise him, but that I like him. And I'd love to be able to say some really comforting words to him before I go. But I wouldn't see it having any more significance than that. But biblically, a father's blessing seems to carry almost the weight of a divine proclamation. So when a father blesses his children, then that blessing means something. Well, Jacob got it, and the blessing that Jacob got was pretty jolly good. Certainly it was something that Esau would have wanted. He said, May God, this is in verse 28, may God give you of heaven's dew, of the earth's riches, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. This is Esau. And in going down through time, the Edomites. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. That's the second time we've heard words. You bless Israel, you'll be blessed. You curse Israel, you'll be cursed. All right? And after Isaac finished blessing him and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. Now he discovers that he's been diddled. He's been shortchanged. You need to read this all yourself. But jumping down to verse 38, Esau said to his father, "Do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me too." Then Esau wept aloud, and his father Isaac answered him, "Your dwelling will be away from the earth's riches, away from the dew of heaven above. You'll live by the sword, and you will serve your brother, but when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck." In other words, Jacob is going to be blessed with the best of everything, and Esau is going to live hard and tough, initially under the authority, I guess, of Jacob. But ultimately he'll throw that off, and the two will be at enmity. That's exactly the situation you see now with the peoples living around Israel. There is not one nation living close to Israel that love them. They have treaties in place with Egypt and with Syria. Yeah. Jordan. Yes, mind you, Jordan's only about that big, isn't it? Yeah. But anyway, for the most part, they hate it. Now you know why. The ones that weren't the descendants of Ishmael are the descendants of Esau. This is why Israel lives in the midst of peoples who hate them. And as you follow their development through, at times they were an immensely strong, powerful empire in their own right. Israel was the most dominant force in the Middle East at one stage under King David. But then God confirms his covenant regarding the promised land again with Jacob in chapter 28, verses 9 and 10. Is it 28, 9 and 10? No, it's not. It's 28, 10 to 15. Jacob left Beersheba and went on to Haran, and when he reached a certain... This is when his mum had sent him away to find a wife. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set, and taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there it stood... And there above it, stood the Lord, and he said, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, and I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you. Wherever you go, I will bring you back." Pay attention to that. Wherever you go, I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised for you. This is the third time this covenantal promise from God has been expressed, but he's added something extra this time. If you are driven away from here, I will bring you back. In other words, this land is always going to be yours. Now, God renamed Jacob, which means supplanter, to Israel, which means he struggles with God after wrestling with him. Genesis chapter 35, you'll find the account of that. Genesis 35, verses 9 and 10. It's in these notes if you want a copy of them. Because of the different relationship that now ensues between the two. And Israel certainly has struggled with God. You look at the history of Israel, the rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. It's like a blooming sawtooth watching it. They get close to God, they rise to a pinnacle, they get sloppy, they get lazy, they go down into apostasy, into evil. They come up because God intervenes for them, and they get up again on top. Then they go down, then they come up, then they go down. And through their history, they had times when they walked closely with God, and they had times when they went so far away that He wanted to destroy them. Make sure we don't do the same thing. We want to walk close with God. We want to stay with God, especially now, because we are getting so close. Israel has 12 sons who became the 12 tribes. I would try to rattle them off, but with the memory that I have now, I could probably get to 6 or 7. Reuben, Asher, Naphtali, Gad, Levi, Dan. Yes, thank you. Well, we're getting there, guys. we got 7 to go. All right, a lot of them. Okay, 12 of them. They became the tribes. One of them was named Joseph. He was the youngest. He was the last son of Israel. He was born to Israel in his old age, and in his birth, his mother, Rebecca, died. So he was particularly precious to Israel. He held him as the last link he had with her, and precious because of who he was. Rachel, sorry, did I say Rebecca? Sorry, yeah, Rachel. Joseph was detested by his brothers because he had dreams. He had exciting dreams that they really would like. Like, last night I had a dream. We were all working out in the fields and we were all making sheaves of grain. And all of a sudden, all of your sheaves stood up and they came over and they bowed down to my sheaf. And then he had another dream. He took it a bit further. The sun, moon and stars all came and bowed down. His father got upset with him. What, do you mean your mother and I, or stepmother, and I are going to bow down to you? Do you know what? That's exactly what happened, because these dreams were from God. But it didn't endear him to his brothers. He's already Daddy's favourite. Daddy buys him a special robe that he didn't buy for all the others. So we've got to treat our children equally. You make a favourite of one of your kids, you're setting them up for problems. He was detested by his brothers. And at one stage, they're all out we won't go through the whole story. Follow it through yourself. You really need to read the book of Genesis to understand what's happening in Israel today. Out in the desert, and his brothers sell him off to some Bedouin traders who are passing through, and he gets taken into Egypt and sold into slavery. While he's in Egypt, he rises to the top. You need to read the account. While he is in there, Genesis 38, thereabouts onwards, he becomes the second most important man in the land after interpreting a dream for Pharaoh that no one else could interpret, which of course, once again, was absolutely spot on, because the dream was from God that he gave to Pharaoh. The interpretation was from God that he gave to Joseph. Joseph became the most important man. So while he's there, his whole family actually joins him, because there is a huge famine, and the only place there is no famine is in Egypt. And the only reason there's no famine in Egypt is because God has shown Pharaoh and Joseph what's going to come, and they make provision. Or more particularly, Joseph makes provision. The Pharaoh just says, here, you know all about it, you sort this out. And he does. And they got food. His family join in there. 75 people, I think it is, go into Egypt. That's the entire family of Abraham at this point. And over the ensuing generations, they grow and multiply. The Egyptians forget the debt that they owe, and they begin to despise them, push them into slavery. And eventually God says, the time has come. I'm going to bring you out of here. And he raises up a man named Moses. Moses, who was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter. And then realising that he's a Jew at some point, he's out walking around one of the cities in Egypt one day, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he takes matters into his own hands and he kills the Egyptian, buries the body in the sand, thinking he'll get away with it. He didn't get away with it. It was reported to Pharaoh what he had done. And the next day, he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he says to them, "Brothers, why are you doing this?" And they say to him, "Why, you're going to kill one of us like you did the Egyptian yesterday." Moses then turns tail and flees into the desert. While he's out there, he winds up getting married, spends 40 years living in the desert. Then he has an encounter with God through a bush that catches fire but is not consumed. I've heard people try to rationalise this one. There is a plant over there somewhere that has pods that get filled with flammable gas. And in the right circumstances, those pods can burst and the gas will ignite. So, poof, little flash. All right? It's probably the same theology that looks at the bombardier beetle that can fire a puff of smoke out of its rear end, and they think that's where the whole thing about dragons came from. No. God talks quite clearly in Job about dragons. They are or were real, and they breathe fire. But this bush isn't just a little pop of a pod bursting, it's blazing. Moses has spent 40 years in this desert. He's attracted. He goes over to see what's going on. And a voice comes from the bush, "You're standing on holy ground, take off your shoes." Moses is there commissioned. This is into the book of Exodus now, in chapter 3. Moses is commissioned to go and call Israel out of Egypt because their slavery has become so severe. So he goes back. He's given signs to show Pharaoh, throwing down his staff, having it turn into a snake, and picking it up and turns back into a staff. He does that in front of Pharaoh. He throws it down, turns into a snake. Pharaoh's magicians use their magic arts, and they do the same thing with their sticks. They throw them down. But Moses' staff eats the snakes that were their sticks, and then he picks it up. Now, it must have been a pretty heavy staff by now. It was packed full of everybody else's piece of wood. Didn't convince Pharaoh. The water of the Nile's turned to blood. Pharaoh's magicians could produce something similar by their arcane arts. Didn't convince Pharaoh. There was a third one. The hand inside the robe, pull it out and it's leprous. Didn't convince Pharaoh. So God sent 10 plagues. The first 4 of those plagues fell on everybody in Egypt. The latter 6 fell only on the land not occupied by Israel, which was the land of Goshen inside of Israel. At the end of the 10th plague, the final plague, which was the plague on the firstborn, the Passover. You're probably all familiar with this. God called them out. There was not one house where there wasn't someone burying somebody. I would have been safe. I was the third in my family, for my mother. Anyone who is a number one, bye, unless you were an Israelite who had kept the Passover and had put blood on the door. Those who had that blood on the door, on the sill, on the top of the door, were protected from the angel of death. It's the same blood today, the blood of Jesus, the sacrifice of God that protects you and I from death. The only thing that means when we get to heaven, we don't have to fear judgment. We don't have to fear God saying, "No, I never knew you. Get away from me and go down to hell where you belong." The only thing that protects us is the blood of the Lamb. And that blood of the Lamb has wiped out the record of your sin. If you go and do something sinful today, make sure you go back to Jesus and ask him for forgiveness so he'll wipe that one out as well. We have to be constantly aware that our behaviour must be impeccable. So, Israel is called out of Egypt through Moses. This is the Exodus. And then they have the wilderness wanderings. They're wandering through the desert. In that time, formal worship is established. They build a tent. Initially, it later becomes a temple. But the shape, the outline, the function of the areas of the temple never change. It just gets more grand as it goes along. The law is given to them. The priesthood is established through Aaron. Levi, the whole tribe of Levi, is set apart for service of the tabernacle, to be the assistants to the priesthood. Israel in that time frequently backslide. They backslide so badly that when they get to the promised land after, I think it's 30 days or 40 days from the time they leave Egypt, they refuse to go in. They send spies in. The spies come back with a false report that the land isn't good and we'll be creamed if we go in there. They refuse to do what God has sent them to do, so they had to spend the next 40 years wandering around in the desert until all those above the age of 20 had died of natural causes and other things because they kept on sinning. So some of them wound up disappearing in plagues. A group of them went into the ground because they rebelled against Moses. There's all sorts of things happened to them. For 40 years they wandered in the desert. By the way, there were millions of them. I'm not sure exactly how many because we don't know how many children there were and so on, but at least 2 or 3 million of them are in an area about the size of Tasmania, smaller. So when the camp got up to move, the tail end of the camp would just about see the head of the camp coming the other way as they moved around. They had a very small area. They really didn't cover much ground. But they spent 40 years there, and in that time they constantly sinned against God. More than once he was going to wipe them out. But because Moses interceded, he didn't. That's good because it tells me that if I make intercession for people that I care about, it just might give them another chance, another opportunity to open up their eyes and see that Jesus is real. It just might be the thing that opens the door. Eventually Israel enter Canaan, and they captured the promised land after their 40 years in the desert. You find that in the book of Joshua. And they are established in what we know today, more or less as Israel. It was bigger than what it is now, but more or less what it is now. I've run out of time. All right, we'll have to finish this next week. At least we got Israel out of the desert. Look, let me emphasise this to you. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation, actually I think they should rename it the Socialist Broadcasting Collective, has brought such shame onto Australia in the last fortnight, such absolute shame by their misrepresentation of what's going on, by their refusal to back down on stories they know to be false. And they are leading the way for the other organisations to follow. About the only television station I can bear to watch at the moment is Sky News. And even there's only a couple of people. A young lady named Shari. I've never had much time for Shari before, but when she was reporting the first night on what happened in Israel, she broke down and wept. And I thought, you've got a lot more depth than I thought, young lady. I've got a lot of time for you. They've been trying to keep it honest. Andrew Bolt's been trying to keep it honest. But most of the media is now feeding out more and more and more, this is all Israel's fault. I'll get to it when I finish this, but Israel has, in our era, since 1917, when the Balfour Declaration from the British declared their intent to establish Israel back as a nation in its homeland. Israel has never started a war. Never. They have not invaded anybody. They have not thrown bombs at anybody. They have not done anything wrong. They have only ever defended themselves. And any media organisation that pretends anything different is lying to you. Israel has every right to be in the land that they are in because God has given it to them indefinitely until he returns. You can make claims if you want to, but it is God's intention that Israel remain in Canaan until Jesus comes back. Because when Jesus comes back, that's where he's coming to. But understand this, we are told in Zechariah chapter 14 that when Jesus comes back, Israel is going to be fighting her last war and she's going to be losing badly. Her women are going to be being raped. Her children killed. This is written in the Word. It lines up exactly, Graham. It lines up exactly with what's happening right now. America has announced that it stands with her. Nobody else is really standing with her, including Australia. We sort of have given lip service to it. But let's face it, if our politicians were serious, do you think they would just sit by and allow the ABC to prosper the stories that they are prospering without comment? Even Joe Biden, I have very little respect for Joe Biden, but even Joe Biden is defying his own administration and taking a strong pro-Israel stance. I don't know what's happened to the man, but I applaud it. No, I do know what's happened to the man. God's got him. I'm not saying he's become a Christian. I mean, God could use Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was not a Jew. But God has got him because he is taking a stand against his own administration or apologising for the things that the president is saying. What sort of things? That we stand with you, Israel. We understand Israel. This is horrible, Israel. We're going to send everything we can to help you, Israel. We'll send you weapons. We'll send you money. And his administration is saying, no, we don't want to do that. Do you know what? Most of America is saying, go for it, Joe. For the first time, you've got us all behind you. It's shaping up.